the message is the messenger. In today's internet, there's increasing distrust when we look at AI-generated content, quote unquote, pink slop, or, people are not trusting brands or corporations or even organizations like Good Power, but who they do trust in this increasingly complex media environment is actually each other.
This is Climate Rising, a podcast from Harvard Business School. I'm your host, Mike Toffel. Today, we're launching a new series on business and climate change storytelling. My guest today is Leah Qusba, CEO of Good Power, a nonprofit organization accelerating the energy transition through research and strategic communication to foster civic engagement and the widespread deployment of renewable power. Here's my conversation with Leah Qusba. Leah, thank you so much for joining us here on Climate Rising.
Thanks for inviting me. It's so lovely to be here with you.
Can you give us an overview of the different programs you run, and then we'll dive into just a few?
Yeah, I think the basic concept of Good Power that I like to tell people is that I think there's a broad realization right now that the economy just isn't working for most people. And Good Power really exists to change that. We think that the key to, accelerating a world that is more equitable, an economy that works for more people, is to sort of reach out and seize this enormous generational economic opportunity that we have, which really is decarbonizing everything from the way we drive to how we grow food to how we use energy. We think this can be a potential renaissance, for the middle class. And I think, Good Power, we basically think the energy transition is inevitable. If you just look around at the statistics, over 90% of all new generation last year was renewable globally. So it's not really a matter of if this transition is going to happen, it's really when. And so I like to say, time has always been our greatest enemy in this work. So how do we get there more quickly? How do we save time to avoid, the worst consequences of climate change? But more importantly, I think today with the cost of living crisis, how do we seize this economic opportunity for people quickly that sort of need relief from everything from rising insurance premiums because of climate to rising energy bills because of global fuel volatility?
Got it. And so there's many ways that you can manifest this mission. And you've chosen to focus on a few of perhaps infinite choices. How do you make those choices about what to lean in on? And we'll talk about your work in energy and in food in particular, but those are two of several programs. And so sort of broadly, assembling the portfolio of activities.
Yeah, over the last roughly 2 decades, we've evolved into this research, advocacy, and campaigning organization. And we're a pretty non-traditional nonprofit in terms of our structure and the way we operate and the way we've really professionalized our staff from the private sector and academia and, careers in political campaigning. We function a lot more like a specialized agency for sort of climate, renewable, and politics than we do as a nonprofit. And sort of the 3 big pillars that guide our work that we just released to the public last September when we launched our 2030 plan is that to realize our mission, we need to focus on, first, shifting culture. There are lots of audiences in the US and around the world that don't yet see, how decarbonization is going to help them, how it's positive and beneficial, how can it save them money, get them a better job, help them, unlock economic security. So how do we shift culture about how people think about decarbonization and the related technologies? I think second, we have to have leaders that are really willing to advance an agenda that helps us realize our mission. So how do we elect leaders? How do we engage more voters who, are going to put energy on the ballot, who are going to put climate on the ballot, right? And we're seeing this play out in the election this week in Arizona, the Salt River Project election. We saw it in the fall in Georgia and record turnout in the Georgia Public Service Commission race. So it's really a focus on voter engagement. And then third, it's really about how do we unlock the economic potential of the energy transition in local communities and at the household level. I know you mentioned this, so we'll probably talk about it, but this is where a large siting and permitting program lives that we've been building for the last few years to really show rural and sometimes conservative communities the real economic promise, like how renewable energy can be an economic lifeline for communities and for households and farmers and, individuals.
That's great. I mean, the fact that you're focusing on some of these key energy transition questions is super interesting, as well as the really the data science that you embed in all of this, the behavioral science. And so we'll talk about that in the context of some of your programs about the testing of messaging and really applying these types of ideas that come in and out of academia. They come also from practitioners. That was part of what I thought was so inspirational, to see a nonprofit really putting into practice these ideas to really hone their message in the most effective and efficient way. That seems like that's been one of the infrastructure pieces that are driving your work across different domains. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think the focus on putting all of these things together, I think some organizations out there might focus on, empirical research, and that is the basis of their mission. Others might focus on local organizing toward particular policy outcomes, and others might focus on digital or strategic communications, and others might focus on something else. And I think we've put together this constellation of, first, organizational capabilities that allow us to be nimble as these issues are dynamic and change frequently. But then also, the constellation of programs, I think, that are very comprehensive, that sort of, look at and attack and debottleneck the roadblocks that we're seeing to realizing that decarbonized future. So I think we've been really systematic about putting together both this world-class team and these capabilities, but also, I think, the vision for the work and the strategic plan and those programmatic pillars.
Great. Well, let's dive into one of these areas, and we'll start maybe with good energy. And that's the work, as I understand it, that you're addressing the siting and permitting for solar and wind. There's lots of projects going on. There's lots of red tape to be managed. The process of permitting was all developed with the idea of giving lots of people input. And that's sort of well-founded in a democracy where you want to have engagement, but it also leads to a lot of stagnation and slowing, and there's huge queues to get some of these renewables online. And that's an area that you're really focusing on with good energy, if I understand that correctly. So take us through a bit about what the problem is that you're trying to solve, how you decide where to solve it, and some of the techniques you're using to address it.
I think starting with, the basic development life cycle of when we build large-scale solar, wind, and battery projects in this country. The permitting process and the regulatory process is extremely complex. If you look state to state, some states permit this at the Public Service Commission or the Public Utility Commission level. Some permit it at the county level. So depending on the state, the jurisdiction and group of decision makers differs wildly. And then I think you look at sort of ground zero or the tip of the spear when you look at disinformation around the renewable energy transition. One of my favorite papers actually is from Robert Brule. He did a paper on the climate change counter movement and estimates that $900 million annually is spent by this group of sort of think tanks and practitioners and their networked social networks to sow doubt and disinformation and sort of deception around what these technologies are. I mean, just this week I saw a new disinformation cluster that I hadn't heard about before that is being spread that solar is a Chinese psyop, and that it's being, solar panels include listening devices to spy on Americans and build data. And of course, this isn't true, but this is an intentional effort to really sow doubt and scare people in rural communities about these projects. We really look at both of these, both the regulatory complexity, but then also the counter forces that seek to kill these projects. And, we tackle both. So right now in 34 states, we run about 190 siting and permitting campaigns. Again, some at the state level, some at the county level. And our unique role is really threefold. First, can we flatten the curve of opposition around these projects by running interference on disinformation and replacing that with stories, fact-based information, stories of other communities that already have solar or wind, and it's been an economic lifeline to farmers, for example. So that's number one. Number two is how do we actually do advocacy? There are supporters across rural America where 90% of this infrastructure is being built that are supportive. They just don't know how to facilitate that support by, giving a public comment or going to testify at a community hearing about the project. And then third, primary research. How do we understand a day in the life of a county commissioner that's faced with this decision? These are not quote unquote elected officials. These are people doing this off the side of their desk 10% of their time. A lot of them are, full-time farmers, but they aren't doing this all day, every day. And so when this disinformation happens and there's community uproar and there's a lot of NIMBYism or not in my backyard around these projects, these county commissioners oftentimes right now are putting a 6-month moratoria in place, or a ban saying, we're going to look at this for the next 6 to 12 months and figure it out. And the result of that is that we're actually banning large-scale renewables right now in our country faster than we're building them. So we try to attack this problem from those angles.
Wow, so interesting. And so let's talk about the approaches that you use. First of all, how do you mentioned about 190 projects that you're tracking. How do you decide, and there's many more, I'm sure, across the country, how do you decide which to focus your attention on? Are they the close calls, the areas where you're viewing opposition, or in states where they have less of a robust track record? Like, what's the heuristics that you're using to figure out where to focus your attention? And then let's talk about what actually your organization does to combat that misinformation.
So we develop organizational intelligence around these opportunities in a couple of different ways. First, we've built specific software technologies in-house that can listen to the internet and tell us when our project's being publicly announced, when our public hearings, which oftentimes are mandatory, they must be publicly announced, when are those being posted on official dockets. We develop intelligence second from partners. There's a big and thriving and wonderful ecosystem of other nonprofits out there that we work really closely with nationally, locally. They may hear about other opportunities, and they're sharing that information, and we're sharing our information. And then third, really from industry groups, from the developers themselves, who can sometimes be quite competitive and secretive about their projects. It's a very competitive field. So getting direct intelligence, even a year out, before a project is publicly announced, allows us to get there more quickly, start doing soft education to the community, and sort of trying to stop the opposition before it forms by not letting the disinformation take root and take hold. So those are sort of the three ways that we develop intelligence around the field of opportunities. And then once we catch those opportunities, we have a really sophisticated renewables team led by Nicholas Farrar, who's our head of renewables. He's been a developer for about 20 years, analyzing these, taking a look at, okay, what are the cost of the upgrades? What is the environmental, governmental, regulatory constraints in this particular area? Like, how real is the project? There's a lot of smoke and mirrors out there. So Nicholas really, with his team, takes a look at the field of opportunity, and we sort of rate those projects using a bunch of tools that we've developed to determine, okay, this is a stronger likelihood of getting permitted than this, or this has no chance really of making it out of the permitting process because of this. And we sort of, with limited resources, are able to prioritize where we go. And then there's great developer tools out there, Inveris, Landgate, Curate, and others. And we build our own software also at Good Power to really look at, okay, if we were a developer, where would we go? Where would we be building? Where are there great resources for wind and sun and for battery storage? So looking at all of that opportunity and then having our team really analyze and make choices on where to invest resources.
Got it. And then in terms of like the tactics that you take once you've identified these, I think your team does some work after the permitting kerfuffle arises, and sometimes even before, in the sense that you're trying to get your education in before misinformation or disinformation campaigns can arise.
Yeah, this is a really, really great question. And, if there are any utility scale developers listening, I would say our greatest message. Now, we've really researched this a lot over the last couple of years through our empirical research lab, led by Dr. Leanne Sangeling on our staff. The earlier, the better. There is no too early, right? It's marketing 101. There's this concept called the mere exposure effect. The more people see something, the more favorable they become to it. Become to it over time. So the earlier we can get into a local community and start, showing that community stories of other nearby communities that already have solar or wind or BESS, battery energy storage. the better we are in the long run, because the cumulative sort of benefits of that education over time come to fruition when you're in the immediate sort of 3 to 12 month window of getting the permit, right? The conditional use permit or the special use permit to actually build the thing. So that would be our greatest message. The ground softening that might, happen prior to being in the acute phase of permitting is critical. And then once you get to that acute phase, we have to deliver support. We have to find the supporters in the local community. A couple years ago when we would be privy to some of these siting meetings or go to a hearing, it was sort of, 50 loud opposers and 0 supporters. And we're really flipping that over the last few years, where we're finding people in the local communities that do want to support the project, see the economic benefit, see the benefit for their community. And the benefits are sometimes different community to community. So it's very nuanced and specialized in how you communicate around each project. How do we help them facilitate that support? How do we show them different ways? Can they phone their county commissioner? Can they submit an official comment on the public docket online? Can they turn up in person? And can we prepare them to give testimony? All sorts of different sort of advocacy outputs that we can deliver around the project. I think those two things, and ultimately our messages, start as early as possible to really head off the opposition before it forms. Because once the disinformation is out there, social science tells us you hear the myth is reinforced, and it's generally the first thing you hear. When the public understanding hardens, it's that first message. So if you're there first and you can get the fact-based narrative, in the minds of the local community before the disinformation, generally your messages can take root.
Got it. So you've been super clear on how you think about your targets. And even now you mentioned the objectives of the outreach would be, for example, to get people to issue public comments or to show up during public hearings, to be able to lend their support to the projects. Let's talk a little bit about the messaging that you deliver. Because when I think about messaging, and I'm not in your field, but we do messaging as academics as well. You think about sort of the content of the message. You think about the channel through which you're delivering the message. And also sometimes who the spokesperson of the message is. And I'm sure there's other dimensions as well that one needs to think about. But this is where you get to what I'll call your engine of using behavioral science and data science to test out different approaches and to use your cumulative knowledge to have a pretty good guess at how to formulate this. But even still, you're, I think, testing and refining your efforts. So can you tell us a little bit about these and other dimensions, the message, the messenger, the channel, and so on, about how you're actually refining this?
Yeah, and I think I'll even go further and be a little spicy and provocative here and say, actually, the message is the messenger. In today's internet, there's increasing distrust when we look at AI-generated content, quote unquote, pink slop, or, people are not trusting brands or corporations or even organizations like Good Power, but who they do trust in this increasingly complex media environment is actually each other, right? So my dad, I love to tell this story, but my dad is he's a Trump supporter, he's a lifelong conservative, and he's also pro-solar, and he's pro-solar not because of me, sadly, but because of his HVAC guy who has a side hustle doing rooftop solar, who convinced my dad, he could save a lot of money. And my dad is driven by an economic first message. So it really, really worked for him. So it's really who delivers the message. And that's twofold. It's not just because they're credible and the person will trust them. It's also because of how the internet works. The internet has tribalized us into these impenetrable echo chambers that we cannot get out of. The internet I see and the internet my dad sees could not be more different. It's like a different internet. And in order to penetrate these echo chambers, we have to trick the algorithms, right? We have to trick them. And the way to trick them is not to have Good Power say the message. It's to have a rural person talk to a rural person. So, the peer-to-peer storytelling or, creator marketing, influencer marketing, whatever you want to call it, is so effective for both of those reasons, because of the trust, or rather the distrust in the internet and institutions, and more trust in one another, but also just how the internet works, and how it really tribalizes us and divides us. And this is a way to kind of skirt that and actually deliver the message to the person you intend to deliver it to.
So you're engaging with folks on the ground in these different communities, trying to find who would be a credible spokesperson?
Yes, we've developed what we think is sort of the largest collection of positive renewable energy stories from rural red America, where the vast majority of this infrastructure is being built. So people in the collection, Republican school superintendent from Oklahoma that talks about the enormous benefits to schools from the local wind economy in that part of Oklahoma. My favorite story, we just had a fire marshal that we released that said, the thing about fires and battery energy storage is they just don't happen. This is the safest technology. So, hearing from a credible messenger like a fire marshal saying battery energy storage is safe. I think also generational farmers, these highly emotional stories where we have a 70-year-old farmer from my state, from southeastern Wisconsin, that says, I've had wind on my land for 20 years. It pays the bills. It's the most reliable crop I have. It put my kids through college. What's controversial about this? This has been an important economic lifeline for my family and for my community. Stories from Texas, unlikely supporters, county commissioners who are from the conservative movement or in the conservative party. We have a mayor from Arizona who's a Republican that says, hey, my community for 25 years, we're going to be financially stable. We've basically balanced our budget through solar paired with storage in our community. So it's less about what we say as brands, and it's more finding these credible messengers. And it's been really difficult over the last 5 years building this collection. But once you find these people, you don't have to compensate them. They want to do this for free. It's like you don't have to pay somebody who drives an EV to go on Reddit and talk about how great they are, because EVs are fun to drive. People just want to do it because they're so passionate and they've seen such value from these technologies. It's really an organic process, and it's been really, really enjoyable.
So interesting. And how do you find these people? I can imagine, there's the physical, like you go into the communities and you sit in the diners and the general stores and you're talking to people, asking who's fired up about this. And I can also imagine an approach where you create a persona on Twitter or Facebook and Instagram, and you generate a profile akin to, as you're describing, your father's, and see, who's actually the counter voice to people who are skeptical about renewables or other approaches.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. This has got to be just the hardest work probably that we do at Good Power, and I have to shout out some of my brilliant teammates. But the person who launched our content studio, I got to say about 10 years ago now, Jennifer Gonzalez, who's our senior director of video, so talented, total pro, ethical professional around storytelling and subject identification, and the whole pre and production and post-production process that goes into telling stories. Her team is absolutely brilliant, and it's a lot of just hard, cold outreach of picking up the phone and finding people where renewables are, getting them to talk to you, and then we send our content studio out to film them. And Jennifer and her team will usually spend a few days, what is a day in the life of this person, and, capturing B-roll of them on their farm or in their home or, in their community or at the fire station. She's a Pulitzer Prize for crisis reporting grant winner. So she's just the best in her field. And she's really, her leadership over the last decade to build and professionalize this content studio, I think, has been amazing. And then the second strategy is really using the modern internet, the influencer and creator marketing economy. There are ranchers and there are county commissioners and there are all sorts of people out there that are monetizing their social media handles. And so you don't have to go on location because people feel comfortable doing a direct camera, filming themselves. So we use both of those strategies. Both are really, really important and sort of different types of deliverables that we produce to do education around these projects.
Got it. And then you're disseminating this through social media channels. Is that the main way that you're actually seeking to influence folks?
Yeah, I mean, like any good campaigner, which ultimately, we're campaigners first at Good Power. We do 360-degree campaigning. So this involves certainly digital. Where are people spending time online? We're an increasingly sort of online society. So what's the media diet of this local community? Where do they get their news? Where do they spend their time on social media? Absolutely critical. But also, we need to be on the phone with them, and we need to be in their mailbox, and they need to see a piece of mail that helps educate them. And they might need to see a billboard or a transit ad. So looking at all of the ways that we can show up in people's lives in a respectful and sort of subtle way, where you're not over marketing and you're not sort of inundating people, but that it's subtle and that it's authentic, I think is the point. And we've seen a lot of success with that.
Wow, so interesting. So how do you measure success of these types of campaigns?
Yeah, well, I think first there's the public opinion metric. Did we actually get the community from NIMBY, not in my backyard, to YIMBY, yes, in my backyard? We've done a tremendous amount of research on this over the last few years through this empirical research lab we have called the Good Data Lab, where we actually measure, short-term randomized controlled trials or longitudinal studies where we're kind of following and measuring, are our interventions actually, resulting in that NIMBY to YIMBY, where somebody was like, oh, I'm really skeptical about these technologies, but after they see a story or they see a series of stories, they're like, wait a second, this sounds like pretty great and not that scary, because this other county, a few counties over in Oklahoma or Indiana or Wisconsin, they've already done this. It's like akin to going on TripAdvisor, and you're planning a vacation and you see a rating for a hotel and it's like, okay, it's 9 out of 10. The food wasn't amazing, but I'd stay there again. I mean, it's the same thing where you're getting this sort of authentic report out from a community that isn't sugar-coated, and it's just really honest and it's really authentic. And I think that has been very effective, and we measure that through some of the research methods that I just mentioned. And then second, I mean, did the project get its permit or not? Did we send this project to construction? We sort of meticulously track all of these projects. What stage are they in? Is there a hearing coming up? What was the outcome of that hearing? And then ultimately, did it result in getting the project all the way through the final permitting stage? And is it on its way to construction? Ultimately, that's how we win. And in our dashboard, I just looked at it before this call, we've sent more than 10 gigawatts of renewable power to construction in the campaigns that we've intervened on. So we're really proud of that.
Great. How does someone who's not familiar with measuring success by the gigawatt, how does one interpret that?
It's a tremendous amount of power. So, on average in the United States, if you look at, one solar farm, like in, at the utility scale, a large scale solar farm, like in Wisconsin, we're looking at 80 megawatts, 100 megawatts, right? So when you're jumping to gigawatts, that's just a tremendous amount of power. So that's a lot of solar farms. We've tracked over 45 wins, so 45 projects that we've sent through and helped get their final permit to send through construction.
Very cool. All right. So let's pivot. It's really interesting stuff on good energy. Let's pivot and talk about good food. So good food focuses on the agricultural system. I think regenerative ag, if I'm not mistaken. So tell us a little bit about the objectives of the Good Food program.
Sure. So Good Food, this is our most new and nascent programmatic focus. This came out of our strategic planning process and the 2030 strategic plan that we just launched in September. And the basic idea here is, from our perspective as an organization, regenerative agriculture is sort of nature's best carbon capture solution, that nature can offer us. And we look at it twofold. One of the major bottlenecks on the supply side is that not enough generational farmers are uptaking regenerative practices. They might be generational farmers who have done it the same way and been engaged in conventional farming for a long time. This is how my mom and dad taught me to do it, or my grandparents taught me to do it. So that's one side of it. How do we educate farmers on the economic benefits of switching from conventional to regenerative practices? For example, lower input costs, less water, lower fertilization costs and tilling costs, etc. And then on the back end, once you produce a regenerative product, you can actually sell that product at a premium to a consumer. So, regenerative eggs or regenerative rice versus conventionally farmed eggs or rice, you can actually sell the regenerative product at a premium, and there's an increasingly growing market for that, which I think brings me to the demand side. How do we create more market demand for these products? I use the analogy when, DVD players came out and they were like $500 and nobody was so special if you had a DVD player. And now they're like, $19 or something at Walmart. And we need to see the demand. We won't see the price of these products fall. We won't see them being accessible to all Americans until we can create the market demand. And then we can really create more people supplying these products. Now, some good indicators here that this is happening. You look at General Mills. They're investing a ton of R&D into regenerative agriculture. And so how on the consumer side do we find those consumers that are already in the marketplace that are ready and willing to pay a premium for a regenerative product? It could be, I think of MAHA, Make America Healthy Again moms who don't want to see toxic chemicals. They don't want to see glyphosate. They want to buy an organic product. They would buy a regenerative product. Those consumers are there in the marketplace. How do we find them and how do we increase that slice of the pie to create more demand over time for some of the regenerative products?
Got it. Okay, so those are the objectives and those are the key stakeholders you're trying to work on, both the supply side and the demand side. And then tell us about the activities of the group to try and convince both the suppliers to supply more and the buyers to be willing to be aware of these products and to be willing to pay a price premium.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the tactics and methods are really similar to the Good Energy program. We also work on decarbonizing transportation, connecting to consumers in the market that might be ready to get into an EV, but haven't been reached yet or don't, understand the full story of the economic potential of getting in one. I think it's the same concept. So the tactics are, largely the same of using 360-degree campaigning to reach these consumers. Similarly with farmers, we have a huge network, a growing network of farmers. We have over 300 farmers already in our list that we have converted as leads through some of our other programmatic areas. So I think largely the tactics are really similar, and you can draw sort of a direct line to, okay, we need to understand the media diet. We need to understand where do these people spend their time? Who are their trusted messengers? So preparing guests for podcasts that are listened to by agricultural communities like Grazing Grass or Farm for Profit, where we're actually preparing guests to go on those podcasts and speak directly to the listeners who are disproportionately from the farming community. So it's, again, just analyzing, I think, the media diet and how these people get their information and who they trust. And I think reaching them similarly on the consumer side, I am a mom of 2 kids, 9 and 11, and, I watch a lot of mom talkers and things like that. So, how do we use influencer marketing, creator marketing to really, get, moms and other parents who are very universally credible messengers and get them to talk to other parents and educate them about why maybe a regenerative product might be good for them and for their families.
Terrific. Very interesting. So the same model of finding out the media diets, finding out spokespeople who are credible and authentic and passionate about it, and then getting their words and their sentiments out into those markets.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's step up a bit and talk beyond these particular programs. Lots of things are changing, I think, in climate storytelling. There's the advent of LLMs and of AI and AI video and deep fakes. There's, why don't we start with that? And in some ways, well, that could make making these media pieces easier because you can just vibe code a video of, say, a Maha mom, you mentioned as an example, telling a story. So they don't need to send someone to the community to find them. You can just invent them. But of course, part of your whole story is about authenticity. And so that would seem a very risky tactic for an organization like yours to take. So it's a tool, but maybe one you might not pursue, but it's certainly a tool that perhaps your opponents might pursue. And so if there's a dramatic technology that's reducing the cost of creating such videos, and if you're not using them, but your opposite sides are using them, then boy, that seems like it would make your job even harder. How is this whole playing out in your organization?
I think AI generated content, AI enabled tools and technologies, some of the agentic orchestration of tasks and processes. I think this is the greatest plot twist right now in climate and energy and sort of political communications. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. We know that something's happening. We know it's happening very quickly. And I think part of our DNA at Good Power, something that we've heard reflected back to us from partners and funders, is that we're generally pretty ahead of the curve at anticipating what happens next and how do we position the organization and sort of our work in anticipation of that thing that's around the corner. And it's sort of like, okay, whatever Good Power's doing, that's where the rest of us will be next year as it relates to communications. And so we have been very bullish on adopting these technologies responsibly and ethically into our organization. I mentioned a few of the AI-enabled products that we use around our Good Energy program. How do we use an AI-enabled web crawler to sort of help us catch these signals of where new renewable energy projects are being announced, or where there's public hearing opportunities where we can weigh in. At the same time, though, what we're seeing is AI manipulation in the siting process. And the industry trade groups like American Clean Power, which we're a member of, and many of our renewable energy partners are seeing this. Lots of nonprofits are seeing this. But few of us are actually doing something about it or mounting a strategic defense and offense around it. So when I say AI manipulation, there's a bunch of case studies now. We saw it first in the UK, where we also do siting and permitting, and then in the US more recently, where decision makers are actually making permitting decisions based on, I hate to say fake people, but really these are people that don't have a real identity. These are bots, fake comments, and sort of fake sentiment, but it's resulting in these real decisions. The most, widely reported news story was the decision in Los Angeles, where 20,000, AI generated fake comments were used in a decision around, a decision there around pollution standards. So for our part, how do we fill the vacuum right now that we're seeing, where there's a lot of talk that we know that these things are happening, it's moving quickly? How do we actually run interference on this? We're building a tool right now, a piece of software called True Voice, where by detecting patterns, are all the comments, do they have the same language structure? Are they the same? Are they from the same IP address? Can we look at timing signatures? Have they all been submitted within the same 20-second period? And then can we look at the identity? Can we look in the voter file? Are these real people? Can we identify them? And what's the algorithm for doing that? And kind of looking at all this data together and presenting this to a siting board or a zoning board or a county commission or a PSC and saying, we just wanted you to be aware. We found really strong evidence that there might be AI-driven manipulation in the siting process. So I think when you boil it down, this is so fast moving. I would say Good Power is one of the leading edge organizations that's trying to be more solutions oriented around, okay, we're all collectively acknowledging how much this is changing our world and how it's affecting our work. But I think on, going a step further and actually developing solutions to run interference, make it more expensive for them, make it more difficult, make them have to evolve their manipulation methods, right? How do we sort of face this head on? And can we eliminate it entirely? Probably not, but I think we can make it a lot more difficult.
Right. So interesting. Yeah. It's a plot twist, as you describe. I love that. So let me forward us to my final question, which is about advice. So for those listening to this, there's been a lot of people, I think, who've been concerned about misinformation and disinformation campaigns who don't know quite what to do about it. There's others who think that there is a knowledge gap, that forget about the disinformation piece, just people don't know about the full sense of costs and benefits of renewables. So for those looking to get engaged in this, whether in the corporate sector, the nonprofit sector, whatever pathway they may pursue in this climate communications space, what are some resources that you tend to recommend people pursue, whether it be websites or conferences or podcasts or whatever it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, my biggest plea and request is that people just talk to their neighbors, talk to your family, talk to your neighbors. You're the best, most credible messenger for the people in your immediate universe and ecosystem. I think the best talking point right now is really around energy prices. I mean, the news story of the day today is that we haven't seen energy prices this high in over 20 years, since 2005. And the more as a society that we rely on fuels tied to these globally volatile markets, the more we sort of import that volatility into Americans' lives. So, you can't price gouge the wind or the sun, right? These things are constant. There's no fuel cost. And so homegrown renewable energy, this is going to help us weather the storm when the world turns sideways or when we have geopolitical conflict like we're seeing today. And we can really avoid this sort of hidden tax on American families that's coming in the form of this global fuel volatility around oil and gas. So that's number one. Talk to your neighbors, please. And then I think second, educate yourself about AI. I think one of the most, interesting books I've read in a really long time, Adam Becker wrote a book. It's called More Everything Forever. And all the moms in book club will probably never let me pick a book again because this is the book I picked for the last moms book club. But, it was really interesting. I think it takes you from the aerial view all the way down to the specifics. And if you're somebody that hasn't really been in the front seat around some of these technologies and how they're changing our world, it's going to affect every single human being on the planet. And I think about my own obsolescence, and I think about our organization's obsolescence, and how do we ethically and responsibly sort of stay on the leading edge of these technologies that are deeply affecting our work, whether we like it or not. We have to sort of face these challenges head on.
Really interesting. Thank you so much, Leah, for spending time talking through your journey and the activities of Good Power. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mike. I really enjoyed it.
That was my conversation with Leah Qusba, CEO of Good Power. Climate Rising is produced by Sophie Wong. Craig McDonald's our audio engineer. Video production by WT Creative. And I'm your host, Mike Toffel. Thanks for joining us.